Hi, this is Pushpa Naurim, and today we are going to discuss some of the early trade theories, which includes mercantilism, absolute advantage theory, and comparative advantage theory. So let's begin with mercantilism, or one may simply say it as a mercantilist theory. This is an economic philosophy that was built around exports and imports, and especially during the period of 16th century to 18th century. This school of thoughts believed that the wealth of a nation can only be increased by maximizing the level of exports and minimizing the level of imports. Okay, so this school of thoughts teaches that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world and all nations are competing against each other for it. Therefore, they believe that exports makes an economy richer because they bring money into the economy, while imports enrich competitors at the economy expense. And the second important concept related to this theory is that they measure wealth in terms of precious metals like gold and silver. Okay, and third important thing is that they believe that nations could gain in trade only at the expense of the other nations. So you see that the theory of mercantilism, they basically revolve around the notions of promoting more exports and encouraging industries and controlling imports. So the major takeaway point from the mercantilism theory is that a nation can only increase wealth only when its export is greater than imports, and they believe in zero-sum game when it comes to trade, which means that nations could gain in trade only at the expense of the other nations. Then comes the absolute advantage theory. The theory of absolute advantage, this was first introduced by economist Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And he argued that countries should specialize in producing those goods for which they have an absolute advantage, meaning they can produce those goods more efficiently and at a lower cost compared to other countries. Therefore, this theory laid the foundations for understanding international traits and benefits of specializations. You can simply understand this way, like for example, if a nation A uses fewer resources to produce goods than nation B, then nation A has an absolute advantage in producing that particular good. So similar is applied to the nations B. Okay, now let us consider that US produces apples and UK produces oranges. Now let us suppose that 1 hour of labor time it produces 6 tons of apples in US but only 1 ton in the UK. On the other hand, 1 hour of labor time produces 5 tons of oranges in the UK but only 4 in the US. So from this you will see that US is more efficient or has an absolute advantage over the UK in the productions of apples, whereas UK has an absolute advantage on the productions of oranges. Now let's understand this. What will happen if trade has to take place between United States and United Kingdom, and if United States is willing to exchange 6 tons of apples for 6 tons of oranges with the UK, then you will see that US will gain 2 tons of oranges, or simply put it 30 minutes of labor time, because US was able to exchange 6 tons of apple for 4 tons domestically. So by undergoing the process of trade, he gains 6 tons of oranges. Now from the UK perspective, you will see that the 6 tons of apple that UK received from the US is now equivalent to the 6 hours of labor time to produce apples in the UK. This same 6 hours can now be utilized to produce 30 tons of oranges in UK. That is 6 hours into the 5 tons of oranges that they were already producing it. So in total they can produce 30 tons of oranges now. So by being able to exchange 6 tons of oranges for 6 tons of apple with the US, the UK gained 24 tons of oranges. How are we getting 24 tons of oranges? 30 tons of oranges minus 60 tons of oranges, we get 24 tons of oranges. Okay, so in other words, UK save almost 5 hours of labor time. From this you will see that comparing US and UK, you will say that UK gains more than US, but as per this theory, that is not the important thing to note down. What is important here is to acknowledge that both nations can gain from specialize in productions and trade. So now you see that as per the absolute advantage theory, when a nation A is efficient in the productions of one commodity but less efficient than the nations B in the producing a second commodity, then both nations can gain by each specializing in the productions of commodity of its absolute advantage and exchanging part of its output with the other nations for the commodity of its absolute disadvantage. This was the absolute advantage theory, but this theory also comes with certain criticism, and the major important one was that it explained a very small part of the world trade today, especially this theory explains trade between the developed nations only, but it skipped to explain the important trade theory between developed and developing countries. So for this very reason, David Ricardo introduces the comparative advantage theory. In 1817, David Ricardo he published a paper, Principle of Political Economy and Taxations, in which he presented the law of comparative advantage. Okay, so according to him, even if one nation is less efficient than the other nations in the productions of both commodities, it is still possible that both nations can gain from trade. How this is possible? This is possible when the first nation specializes an export of the commodity in which its absolute disadvantage is smaller and import a commodity in which its absolute disadvantage is greater. Now, let us suppose that 1 hour of labor time produces 6 tons of apples in the US, but only 1 ton in the UK, and 1 hour of labor time it produces 4 tons of oranges in the US, but only 2 tons of oranges in the UK. From this, you see that US has an absolute advantage in the productions of both apples and oranges, and UK has an absolute disadvantage in the productions of both apples and oranges with respect to US. However, if you look at this table carefully, you will see that UK labor is half as productive in oranges but 6 times less productive in apples with respect to the US. Therefore, the UK has comparative advantage on the productions of oranges compared to the apples. On the other hand, US, even though has an absolute advantage in the productions of both apples and oranges with respect to UK, but since its absolute advantage is greater in the productions of apple than oranges, US has a comparative advantage in the productions of apple. Therefore, according to comparative advantage theory, it said that both nations can gain if US specializes in the productions of apples and export some of it in exchange of British oranges. Okay, at the same time, the UK can be benefited if it specializes in the productions and exporting some part of its oranges with the UK. Now let's try to understand the conditions of trade between US and UK. From the US perspective, you will see that the country would be indifferent to trade if it is received only 4 tons of oranges from the UK in exchange of 6 tons of apples, since the US can produce exactly 4 tons of apples domestically. Again, US would certainly not trade with UK if it is received less than 4 tons of oranges for 6 tons of apple. Okay. Now, from the UK perspective, UK would be indifferent to trade if it has to give up 2 tons of oranges for each 1 tons of apples it received from the US, and it certainly would not trade if it has to give up more than 2 tons of oranges for 1 ton of apple. Now, to show that both nations can gain, let us suppose that US is willing to exchange 6 tons of apples for 6 tons of oranges with the UK. Okay, by doing this, US would gain 2 tons of oranges, since the US could only exchange 6 tons of apples for 4 tons of oranges domestically. Okay, again, from the UK perspective, the 6 tons of apple that the UK received from the US is equivalent to 6 hours that would have taken to produce apple in the UK. Now UK could use those 6 hours to produce 12 tons of oranges and give up only 6 tons of oranges for 6 tons of apples from the US. Thus, the UK would gain 6 tons of oranges, or save 3 hours. Okay, so UK benefit more than US, but that's not important thing to consider here. What is important to consider is that by undergoing into the process of trade between US and UK, they both can gain from trade. However, this is not the only rate of exchange at which mutually beneficial trade can take place between US and UK. Since US could exchange 6 tons of apple for 4 tons of oranges domestically, the US would gain if it could exchange 6 tons of apples for more than 4 tons of oranges from the UK. On the other hand, in the UK, 6 tons of apple, which is now equivalent to 12 tons of oranges, in the sense that both require 6 hours to produce. So anything less than 12 tons of oranges that UK must give up to obtain 6 tons of apples from the US represent gains from trade. So you see that the range for mutually advantageous trade is when the 6 tons of apples is exchanged for oranges that is greater than 4 tons but less than 12 tons. And the spread between 12 tons of oranges and 4 tons of oranges, it represents the total gain from trade available to be shared by the two nations by trading 6 tons of apples. Okay, that's the end of it. And in this video we have discussed about mercantilism, the absolute advantage theory, comparative advantage theory with respective examples. I hope you find this video helpful. Thank you for stopping by.